This episode of Welcome to Dystopia is sponsored by Grindstone Shoes. Grindstone Shoes is a third generation of family of shoemakers that uses high quality leather to make high quality men's dress shoes and boots at a good price. Mo and I each have a pair. We've worn them for over a month, trying them out, testing them out in different situations, and we like them. If you don't believe us, go and look at the 5-star customer reviews on their website. They have a lot of them, and there's also very good reviews from independent fashion bloggers. If you like how the shoes look, enter promo code SILVER, SILVER, for 10% off your order. That's grindstoneshoes.com. Enter promo code SILVER. Hi, everyone. It's Jason Burack of Wall Street for Main Street and managing editor of The News Doctors and independent financial journalist Eric Dubin. Welcome back to another Welcome to Dystopia podcast. This is episode number 29. This is going to be the post-election 2016 episode. But before we talk about the election and how Donald Trump's policies may affect the economy and how his cabinet may affect the economy, let's talk about the gold and silver markets. Eric, we've had a pretty large correction recently, but you're telling me today you think the bottom is now in for gold and silver?
Yeah, I do. I think that we've had a spasm of 4 trading days ever since the Tuesday election, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and then today on Monday. We've seen bond market perturbations worldwide, and 30-year and 20-year bond rates shooting higher. The 30-year went over 3% this morning for the first time since January, and the whole expectation of tighter credit markets running up against the borrowings of what will be trillions of dollars in infrastructure spends when all is said and done worldwide, and at least in terms of the plans that have been discussed and are now beginning to be better understood by the marketplace. I mean, you and I have been talking about this for months, and it was astounding how fast the markets on Wednesday morning began to recognize that Trump's discussion about the degree or the magnitude of these infrastructure programs would in fact have an impact on the bond markets, and we've seen that translate through. We've seen the dollar index begin to accelerate to the upside, and just today we passed over 100 on the DXY index. And at the same time, over in China, the yuan, the renminbi, fell to its lowest level against the dollar ever. And then China, they're trying to, stem the volatility that's coming into their currency and the stresses that are in their own credit markets when it comes to the offshore rate versus what's going on with the yuan in their domestic market. All of these things kind of hit like a tornado when the election unfolded. I mean, I love how markets can humble even somebody who nails so many things correct. I had my head handed to me on Wednesday morning with all of my precious metals trades going against me, even though I was able to nail the election almost to the exact state in terms of the electoral map and how Trump's win would unfold, where it would unfold, how the media was getting things wrong. I mean, I reflect back on the really great interview you were doing with Jim Rickards before the election, and Rickards was also talking to Greg Hunter that weekend before your interview, and he was talking about how we were looking at Brexit 2.0, basically, was the argument that Rickards was making, and how, people would be surprised at the outcome with Trump winning, and and I believe Rickards even made the argument that because Trump is generically pro-gold and has made noises to the effect of possibly even being supportive of having gold as having a role within the monetary system, which is Rickards' argument overall when it comes to, how the end game is going to unfold after our next mega crash. So he was making the argument in your interview that once Trump would win, people would look towards gold, and that we would see $100 some odd move in gold, and maybe even 1,000-point decline in the Dow, and all of these things that would be evocative of how June/July unfolded with that fateful Friday post-Brexit vote. And it was really interesting to see how it's clear the market actually began to understand this stuff pretty quickly, as opposed to what happened on that Friday with Brexit. We turned around, and some of this pulling back in precious metals, frankly, I don't think was 100% manipulation. I think it's a combination of manipulation as well as just people's expectations shifting around a lot. We had, like, for example, Druckenmiller talking about rising interest rates in the face of the changes in the infrastructure program, putting pressure on gold, in the traditional interpretation of how gold would fall off in the short term with, reaction to the election and all of that. But the thing is that we're looking at the interest rates backing up, and in 2017, as we get, further into this whole infrastructure program and nations around the world, Japan, probably the UK, probably to some extent within Europe, and most certainly within the United States, we're going to see a huge amount of borrowing into the credit markets, and the bond vigilantes have woken up because they recognize that the level of debt that we have today is so large that it's, as a point that you made to me earlier this week, it's not like how it was in China in 2013-14 when they went cuckoo with their investment efforts to try to reflate their system. Now they can't do that very easily because of the level of debt that they have. And we're in the same kind of analogous situation in the United States. We have, some $20-odd trillion of formal, officially declared debt, and the debt servicing of our annual budgets would balloon to over $500 million extra debt servicing costs on an annual basis if we had anything approaching normalized interest rates. And this normalized interest rate quagmire that we're going to end up moving towards, regardless of what the Fed wants to do, because it's going to end up starting to break things in the market. And I think the overall thesis that I've been advancing when it comes to what will make the financial markets end up losing traction and people giving up the ghost when it comes to the operating assumption that the central bankers always have the traders' backs, and the investment community believing that asset prices will always be catched when they fall. All of that's going to go out the window when the bond market begins to break things. And I think that's what we're looking at in 2017. And, the Larry Summers of the world believe that, at least they hope that they believe that the infrastructure spends will reboot the economy and not have a gigantic impact on interest rates. They believe that these 6 months ago, at levels of interest rates that had never existed in human history, would be the prevailing norm with a slight upward drift as these programs move forward. And I think that what we just saw in the last 4 trading days substantiates a lot of what you and I have been talking about as well when it comes to this whole infrastructure's program's unintended consequences. This is going to be the real surprise, I think, that comes in 2017. And what we saw in the last 4 days gives me even more confidence that my assessment about the bond market serving as the ultimate black swan is, in fact, accurate. 2017 will end up having people like Druckenmiller recognizing that the old tried and true relationships of rising interest rates like we had in the 1970s occurring exactly along the same time that we have stagflation, rising inflation, rising gold prices, rising geopolitical problems. I mean, those echoes from history are going to replay themselves in 2017, in my opinion. And, that's the more intermediate, longer-term kind of picture. But when it comes to what we just went through, we saw a really huge move in equities, a really large move in bonds, and the shock to precious metals have, been pretty substantial. And then when we look at how markets are settling out today, 4 days later, it looks like we're beginning to see some stability. I think that, we're recording this on November 14th. Markets are closed now in terms of the regular COMEX session. And I believe that we may see maybe another 20, 30 cents downside on silver, as an example, within the next 24 hours. But we're in the process of beginning to put in the bottom, and the acceleration to the downside petered out today. And we can see, examples of other huge moves that were initiated following the election, like, for example, what happened to copper and the huge move that it had sustained, peter out as well, too. So I think, these kind of shocks happen in markets where a sudden shift on a fundamental basis gets introduced and money scrambles and people scramble when their positions go against them, and then eventually we begin to get some kind of a settling out, and that's what we're seeing today. We can see it in lots of different markets. So I think that we did basically bottom in precious metals. I don't think we're going to go any lower than, I certainly don't think we're going to see silver, as an example, lose the $16 handle, because the market is a lot tighter than what people generally believe. And we have seen that when it comes to how premiums have shifted up and down in the last 2 months in relation to where metals have been moving.
Now, Stanley Druckenmiller actually said he expects more inflation, but he thinks gold won't do well in it. So it's kind of confusing. The guy is a billionaire. He has a successful track record of making a lot of investments, and people copy his trades whenever he releases something publicly. I'm sure a lot of, hedge fund managers and Johnny-come-latelys and trend traders, when Stanley Druckenmiller originally got on the gold trade, by the way, he didn't buy any physical gold. He just bought GLD. So he put a lot of money into GLD. But, the guy politically, this could be a political move why he sold his gold. The guy is connected to George Soros. He's an unapologetic rich Democrat. I've watched his long speeches about how to fix Social Security, and he's like, oh, if we just increase this tax 6%, this tax 6% per year, then we can pay off all of the unfunded liabilities over, the next 20 or 30 years with economic growth and a tax increase. As if that can magically be done. So I think he's wrong on that.
To give him credit where credit is due, his call was correct when it comes to the short term. He, before the election, said that gold would get hit, and in fact that's what happened. But the thing is that he is basically parroting the shorter-term understanding of the nature of interest rates and how they would react to what's going on with the economy and how gold in turn would react. It's not unlike how all through 2015 we had to deal with the Federal Reserve and all of the talking heads doing their jawboning about interest rate normalization around the corner, endlessly so. And every time we would go through one of the cycles where you'd have 4 or more or however many of these Federal Reserve board members coming out in the media and beating the drums as to where they would want the sentiment to be painted, we'd see gold go down. And everyone would expect the same kind of dynamics to unfold. But the difference is that, that's a more shorter term kind of call, and it's operative and working right now because, the thing is that the bond market hasn't begun to break things. And when the bond market begins to break things, when we, see the 30-year, instead of just nicking over 3%, you get over 4% in 3 months, holy cow. That's going to start changing a lot of internal dynamics between asset classes across the world. And when that happens, when inflation expectations begin to percolate higher and people don't just think about it in terms of an interesting theory, but in fact see it staring themselves right in the face, gold is going to get afterburners. And then you have the dynamic, too, of the Fed probably being a little scared to death of the dollar rising as much as it has already. It's not unlike how you and I were talking about how back in our shows in October and November, looking forward to that fateful December 16th day when the FOMC finally did raise by so-called 25 basis points, effectively 13 because that's all they can manage. That kind of song and dance is not unlike where we are right now. But 3 months out, interest rates rising. Interest rates all across the world. Germany shot up. UK, even Japan's long-term bond market managed to squeak in some rise in interest rates in the last couple of days. The whole credit market is signaling very dangerous signs. And people are going to begin to see this a little bit more and talk about it more as the interest rates move higher and higher. It's already beginning to happen when you look at, coverage, for example, on zero hedge today and whatnot. And some of the brokerage analysts in the sell side community on Wall Street are issuing reports that are basically getting indication that people are afraid of what's happening in the bond market, and they should be, because we've lived through an absolutely insane period since 2008 where all of these crazy policymakers in the West created interest rates even negative in Germany and Switzerland, and the kind of paradigm that was forced down the throat collectively of our financial and economic world is metaphorically just completely insane. And we're going to see the unwinding of that.
I also think the bond market guys are starting to price in Trump's potential supply side economics. Maybe in a month I could get Paul Craig Roberts on here, since he was Assistant Treasury Secretary under the Ronald Reagan administration, and he was considered one of the main implementers of Reaganomics, along with Laffer and a couple other people. So I would be curious for his opinions about Trump's proposals here for tax cuts in the private sector, and then massive government spending programs on military and defense, on building a wall, on infrastructure. Those are a lot of potential spending programs. We already have $20 trillion in stated debt. Obviously there's a lot of unfunded liabilities. But the other thing I mentioned in my short video yesterday, Eric, is compared to 1980 during the Ronald Reagan administration, when supply side economics was implemented and the tax base was broadened more and people were given tax cuts, there was a lot less debt pervasive throughout society. Now there's a lot more debt in all levels of society. So there's no guarantees that, these tax cuts will actually create real economic growth. This is just another large science experiment. It's not quite the same one that the Keynesians at the Federal Reserve want to do. So it'll be interesting to see what gets implemented and what doesn't. But I have a couple comments on gold before we start talking more about the election and Trump. With this drop in the paper prices in gold and silver, we're back to levels now pre-Brexit. And these levels are the existing miners that have primary gold and silver mines. They've been slashing their costs for a while now, so they can tread water okay. But this is why, miners were heavily criticized. Basically earlier in the year when gold was around $13.50 and silver was above 18, and the miners were going to the market raising capital, and people are like, well, why do you need to raise capital now? Well, the miners were heavily criticized, a lot of them. Well, they had bad balance sheets for one, and they didn't know how long the rally was going to be sustained for. So their main goal was to protect their balance sheet. And so that they could tread water. They had cut costs, but they still weren't generating a lot of free cash flow, and their balance sheets were in such dire straits, a lot of them, very high percentage for, the last 5 years, that, they had to go and raise capital when their equity prices had gone up higher. So, the miners who have fixed their balance sheets when gold and silver were rising up, that's just a prudent way to run your business. In the mining industry, unfortunately, a lot of primary gold and silver miners, even when the gold and silver price was much higher, when gold was at 1900, when silver was around 50, a lot of these primary miners, their share price was high, but the underlying parts of the business, their operating cash flow, their costs, they were not generating as much free cash flow as you would have expected. The industry just struggles for a bunch of different reasons. Normally what happens is there's bad acquisitions. The management doesn't focus on maintaining margins when the prices of metals rise. Costs spiral out of control. Management tries to bring on, higher and higher cost deposits to increase the operational leverage to the higher metals price. They bring on more and more marginal deposits so they could try and increase revenue, but their margins take a huge sacrifice. So I think what this ultimately means, Eric, with the correction also, is that it's going to be very difficult for more than a handful of really good potential primary gold and silver mines that have really good grades, pretty low costs. They're near infrastructure. They have really good, reasonable capital expenditures. It's going to be tough for a lot of potential new gold mines to raise the money now that we've had this downward correction in gold prices. So this is going to delay new primary gold and silver mines coming online to replace depleted reserves, I would say, for an at least additional 2 to 3 years, this correction that we've had now. So it's going to spook a lot of people off. I had already been hearing from some of my contacts that there just wasn't a lot of money in order to go directly to a bank and raise all the capital. That capital had to be raised in portions, part equity, part debt, part streaming financing. And, now that we've had this deterrent here, the miners were reluctant in the past to go and get streaming done, but they may have no choice if they want to build a new mine.
And there was so much damage done over the last 4 years anyway that, the 7-month reprieve that we had with precious metals shooting higher and getting people excited and whatnot certainly did not fix everything. So we have a slog ahead.
Yeah, I agree. And, this copper rally, it may prevent a lot of these primary copper miners that I was hoping would shut off their more higher cost copper mines or go bankrupt. This may allow them to raise some more capital. So I was hoping we'd have a big washout in copper prices. We didn't have a lot of supply come offline. We've had CapEx cuts, and we've had some bankruptcies in copper and some mines put on care and maintenance, but not nearly as many as I thought there would, given how much the copper price has come down. I think a lot of it has been because of what happened in the shale oil, how there was a lot of hedges. There was a lot of copper miners that had hedges on their copper production for 3 or 4 years at a higher copper price. So some of them still have hedges on at a much higher copper price for another year or two. That's saved their bacon. Okay, well, I want to transition now to the election results. Now, Eric, you were telling me for a week or two before the actual election that you thought Trump was going to win pretty darn big. Now, in some of the states, Hillary Clinton looks like it made it close, but we've heard from sources that are close to the Trump campaign, like Alex Jones, who speaks with a lot of people in the Trump campaign, that they think there was at least 5 states where there was major vote rigging and vote manipulation and voter fraud. But Trump was able to do something that really no other Republican had done since Ronald Reagan in 1980. I wrote an article about this on the News Doctors if our listeners want to go read it a couple days ago, the real reasons why corrupt Hillary Clinton lost the election, and it was mentioned in there. Not that Trump is a real Republican, but, he basically copied the Ronald Reagan strategy, wouldn't you say, in order to win this election.
Well, there's a lot of echoes when it comes to what happened with the Reagan win. And in fact, for over a year, you and I have been talking about how we would likely see the possibility of, a Reagan electoral college sweep as the outcome. And that's how the map ended up being. The shift that we saw in the Rust Belt and in the heartland when it comes to the Farm Belt were quite significant. Michigan flipping to Trump actually surprised me, but we could tell, for example, looking at the polling data and the way in which the national polls were being spun versus the more interesting state-run polls that weren't necessarily being tweaked for a national audience for propaganda purposes, but were in fact being served to a local market because, for example, I'm forgetting the name of the paper actually who ran it, but in Ohio, in Iowa, there was a poll within the 10 days prior to the election that demonstrated with 30 some odd % of the people having already voted because they had early voting in that state, 2/3 of the people who had yet to cast their ballots indicated a shift of almost 20 percentage points towards Trump in the wake of all of the revelations with the Podesta email and WikiLeaks and all of the crazy scandals that were getting almost like a crescendo going into the election in terms of public awareness of just how nefarious the whole Democratic National Committee was when it came to screwing over Bernie Sanders and the corruption of Hillary and on and on and on. And it was completely subterranean in terms of its the polling data when it came to what was going on in these individual contests. And it was visible. I could see how the Rust Belt and the Farm Belt were going to massively switch to Trump, and that particular poll indicated it. We saw almost 20% point move with the remainder of people who had yet to vote. And the national media continued to parrot what betting parlors were estimating, kind of like what we saw with Brexit and on and on. But the popular vote for Trump was no doubt a lot bigger than what ultimately was being recorded because of all of the manipulation. And I think and I can't prove any of this, maybe some point after a lot more forensic analysis by investigative journalists and citizen journalists and so forth happens over the coming month or so. But it's pretty clear that we saw a reasonable amount of vote rigging of various types. And it's likely the case that Trump actually pulled a lot more in terms of the public popular vote than what is being reported, and that's part of the reason why he won. I mean, the whole establishment was endlessly parroting the idea and framing reality that a Trump win would be impossible. When he first started out, odds in Vegas were 150 to 1 that Trump would win. And even up until the very day of the election, Biden was talking to the media and basically indicating that Hillary had no intention of even considering what it would be like to have to do a concession speech or what have you. So, I mean, it was a full court press from the media across the board. The New York Times has, in the last 2 days, come out with a publisher issuing a letter to the readers of the New York Times apologizing for the lousy coverage that they did, because they recognize that the whole tone of the mainstream media has been so over to the top that they're even losing credibility and their audience.
Yeah, not just losing credibility, Eric. They had thousands of subscribers cancel, and they got a lot of nasty comments that you're covering this election totally unfair. I mean, look what we found out in the WikiLeaks Podesta emails revelations. Look what we found out from the Project Veritas videos. I mean, there was crimes here. I don't think, unfortunately, the corrupt FBI is going to actually... There's obviously honest FBI agents that are doing their job and investigating, but when the evidence gets passed up the chain to people like Comey or people at the Attorney General's office, Department of Justice like Loretta Lynch, or before her, corrupt Eric Holder, these things are being blocked. So, it seemed like the fix was basically in, whether it was the mainstream media, whether it was so many other groups that were involved, that they were going to basically, we know this from the WikiLeaks, that one of the strategies for Podesta was to come out weeks early and announce that Hillary had won and there was no way she could lose, to discourage any marginal Trump voter from actually going to the polls.
And they've been doing that for over a year, too, in various ways.
Well, it didn't work. It was a giant middle finger, right, to the status quo, to the corrupt DC politicians, to Wall Street, to large corporations. I heard stories. One of my friends who I was speaking to, she told me that large corporations told their employees if they were publicly supporting Trump on social media and they damaged any of the brand of their corporation, they would be fired. So What the corporation basically said is, okay, you're allowed to vote Trump, but if you promote it before the election that you're voting Trump and you hurt our brand, you cost us customers, your ass is fired. So, and I heard similar stories from my contacts on Wall Street that almost all the donation money was going to Hillary.
Yeah, I think she pulled $56 million, and Trump's total campaign was less than that. But that's what she pulled from Wall Street.
Yeah, so I mean, the people on Main Street, this was a revolt. And I think, you mentioned the Rust Belt and the Farm Belt. There was a lot of people, a lot of white people that had voted for Obama in the last couple elections, and they were hoping that Obama would fix some of the corruption on Wall Street and some of the other stuff, and Obama didn't do what he said, and there was a marginal vote, and, they switched their votes to Trump. And Trump actually did better than any mainstream person thought with white American women, with Latinos and African Americans. So he was able to do a lot better with the voter demographic that people said, the mainstream pollsters and Democrats on TV, on the mainstream media, said he had no chance of doing better or winning at all. And so, that made the difference. He totally kicked her butt in the Electoral College. The people who are saying she should switch to the Electoral College now, I think one of the reasons, Eric, that she's not contesting the election more is that the Trump campaign has, legitimate evidence that there was at least 5 states that Hillary Clinton stole with vote rigging and voter fraud that she should not have won. And one of them is Virginia, who's run by Governor Terry McAuliffe, who's really good friends with the Clintons for a very, very long time, and he was even one of the board members at the Clinton Foundation. And he allowed, I saw this article on InfoWars, I was actually searching for it on other sources, but none of the mainstream media even covered this. Governor Terry McAuliffe allowed in April of this year 200,000 felons the right to vote. And in Virginia, it was a very, very close vote. Basically, you have Northern Virginia, which is densely populated, and an enormous amount of government employees and Democrats have moved here, and they all vote Democrat. They want big government. And, they run these campaign articles now about, so-and-so, if for local politicians, so-and-so is too right-wing, you can never vote for her. Those are like the campaign TV commercials now for the against the Republican candidate. And then you have the rest of the state, which is more Republican. Virginia used to be more Republican, but look at D.C. How I think 93% of the vote in D.C. was Democrat.
Yeah.
And it's really expensive to live in D.C. So there's all these taxes, there's extra property taxes, all these other taxes layered on. So if you own a house or a nice condo or something in D.C., there's an enormous amount of taxes that are layered on. So they're part of this crony system. This is a swamp that Donald Trump wants to drain. I think a lot of people, Eric, who don't live around D.C. or haven't lived here before, they aren't aware of the magnitude of corruption here. So it's going to be very difficult for Donald Trump to drain the swamp. He's going to have Democrats, neocon Republicans, lobbyists, government bureaucrats. He's going to have all these different groups fighting him for every inch to make legitimate change. It's going to be extremely difficult. So people who think that, he's not doing a good job after only a month or 2 months or 1 year, they don't understand how entrenched corruption is here in D.C. from both parties and all these other special interest groups and government employees and et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
Yeah, so he's going to have to do this in steps. There's a great, actually, discussion I encourage our listeners to go listen to from Dr. Pippa Malmgren and her father, Dr. Harold Malmgren. We can maybe put a link to it in the info section. Harold Malmgren was the economic advisor for 4 or 5 presidents in the past, and he's retired now. And so he was talking about how long it takes to select a cabinet and regime change and start implementing policies. I mean, a lot of the changes that Donald Trump is proposing, Eric, with the taxes and infrastructure, he's going to have Congress on board. So Congress is maybe for Supreme Court judges, if Donald Trump is picking out a constitutional Supreme Court judge, one that's strictly to the Constitution. Some of these, rhino Republicans or neocons may go along with that. But a lot of the other stuff that Donald Trump wants to get done that he's talked about in his 100 days plan, especially term limits. I think the odds of Donald Trump actually convincing these career politicians that get rich in D.C. from only 5 or 10 years of being a career politician and then, going into lobbying and all the other stuff, I think that's like slitting their own throats, man. I don't think he's going to be able to convince any of these guys to agree to term limits.
And the whole draining of the swamp is going to involve a lot of friction when it comes to any kind of reduction that he does when it comes to the bureaucracies of the federal government. He's made noises along the lines of trying to make federal government more efficient and whatnot, and that'll be a buzzsaw that he'll run smack into when he tries to do anything in that direction. So it'll be interesting to watch.
Well, they're going to want trade-offs. So if he's going to want cuts here, the other people are going to want log rolling or back scratching somewhere else, and it's going to be away from the public view. And this is just how the lobbyists and a lot of the congressmen work now is, they sneak things into bills at the last minute that have nothing to do with the bill that's being passed. Unfortunately, this is how things have businesses done now in D.C. It wasn't always this way. Things used to be a lot more simple. But, really for a couple decades now, this is how the corruption gets done. And there's a great documentary out there called The Best Government Money Could Buy. And a lot of these large corporations, instead of spending more money investing in research and development and building, factories here in the U.S., they spend a lot of money on lobbying to give them, government contracts or to limit competition. So until these large corporations can stop getting 10-to-1 returns on their money for lobbying, we're going to have a huge problem with corruption and big government continuing to grow and hurting the private sector.
Oftentimes it's 1,000 times return on one's investment per dollar for lobbying. I mean, the corporate America gets more in terms of bang for its buck by lobbying than pretty much any other investment activity, and that kind of goes along with the whole devolution of our system and the corruption that we have.
Yeah, I completely agree. It might be more than 10 to 1. I'd have to read.
Oh, it's an order of magnitude bigger.
Yeah, I think it was actually 100 to 1. They interviewed a lobbyist who was actually bold enough to speak on the camera. But I mean, the point of all this with these examples, guys, is that Trump will be blocked every step of the way. Every inch of change that he wants he will have to fight tooth and nail for. And, that leads us to his administration. He has some curious picks already for his administration. Obviously, there's no guarantees that a lot of these guys are going to stick for very long. Alex Jones has mentioned that Trump, for some of these guys, if they don't do their job, Trump will get rid of. He'll act like he's on The Apprentice, and he'll fire them like within 90 days or less. So, but he's had some curious picks for his administration already for his cabinet.
Yeah, well, I mean, you did the most obnoxious discussion and speculations concern the Treasury Secretary position, where he's talking about Jamie Dimon or John Paulson. I mean, holy cow, that would be really obnoxious to see one of those scumbags in that position. When it comes to Secretary of State, names like John Bolton are being surfaced. I mean, John Bolton in the 1980s was running death squads in El Salvador and Nicaragua. He somehow, some way has been able to rehabilitate his reputation to the point where Bolton even shows up in Freedom Fest keynote speeches and makes his way even in some libertarian segments of the Republican Party. I mean, these indications are very disturbing, and it suggests that, I mean, the most charitable interpretation that we can even make would be along the lines of Trump trying to keep his enemies close so that he can navigate what it will be like on a foreign policy front, for example, when it comes to him trying to, for example, bring some rapprochement when in the relationship with Russia and dialing back Cold War 2.0, which was already well underway and rebooted. I mean, that relationship and outcome with Trump's ascendancy to the presidency is one of the few things that we can actually point to as being pretty much a foregone conclusion as far as what we can count as positives from this election. Hillary Clinton would have taken us all the way towards efforts of regime change and colored revolution tactics launched against Russia directly. I mean, that's how crazy the neocons were when it came to ingratiating themselves in the interests that are intertwined within the military-industrial congressional complex and aggressive war and empire, pursuant towards trying to keep a American century of unipolar power over geopolitics and the world order on a going forward basis. I mean, the neocons and their project for a new American century penned in 1997 and brought about the entire vision under the George Bush Jr. administration and aggressive wars that came with that and all of the most ugly aspects of that particular faction of the Republican Party. Well, all those damn bastards, all those damn neocons are now circling around Trump in some respects too. I mean, we have to be ever vigilant and aware of what failings may come from this administration. Trump should not get a free pass, not in the slightest. But there are some things that are positive. We can certainly point to the likelihood that we will not see Cold War 2.0 aggressively launched and further exacerbated as it has already been launched. I look towards that as being a positive.
In this day and age, Eric, with social media, I mean, people are going to call him out pretty quickly if he starts reneging on his word. But that, I mean, he wasn't a politician when he won this election. But once he gets here, it's going to be very difficult for him to do what he says. He's going to be blocked. He's going to have to work very hard to accomplish his goals. Before we start talking about some of his economic policies, I'm just relieved that Hillary Clinton didn't win. If she would have won, she would have gotten to pick those Supreme Court justices, which will have a much longer impact than just, 1 or 2 terms as president. Hillary Clinton could have systematically gone after whatever was left of the Constitution. She could have taken away full Second Amendment rights. She could have taken away parts of freedom of speech. She was talking about how once she won the election, she wanted to go after with the Department of Justice people like Alex Jones and Breitbart and Matt Drudge from the Drudge Report. So that I'm just glad that we still at least have some ability to go on here and talk and have this podcast, because had Hillary won, man, it might have been time to go to Panama.
Yeah, you were offering me a visa to Panama, and I probably would have taken you up on that. And it's no joke that the war on media would have been vicious, and that's another thing that we can point to as being something that's positive, because Trump basically every single day of his campaign had to endure the media beating him up. And that's probably left quite a bad taste in his mouth. And it was only a couple of weeks back when the AT&T merger talk was going around that he was even talking about repealing FCC licenses and using antitrust to prevent media mergers. And this is along the lines of making big statements from a policy perspective that he probably would never necessarily be able to push through. But it is interesting that these different ways of looking at the whole glide path that we've been on when it comes to the establishment, basically ever more pushing towards higher concentration in media, higher concentration in the banking system, and consolidation of power into tighter and tighter and tighter hands, and the devolution of individual liberty as a result. In the grand scheme of things, at least we're not on the super fast path of globalist dreams that everything that Hillary represented entails. And so, we have somewhat of a breather here. And I know that there are a lot of people that even go as far as to conclude that, this whole Trump phenomenon is nothing more than a Trojan horse phenomenon, and that he's actually representing what the establishment wants. And I don't buy that thesis. I think that we're in a nuanced kind of scenario, and the shades of gray are going to be where the truth is told, and we'll just take time to see how things shake out. It's good that we actually aren't recording our show last Friday like we were planning due to technical difficulties and whatnot, because we've had a little bit more time to see some of the more interesting announcements when it comes to who he's planning for his cabinet. But we still have another week or two before we really can truly see what those data points, so to speak, will be telling us, the people, and what signals we can draw from the individuals he finally selects.
Yeah, who knows? Who knows if Trump will do what he says? But Hillary Clinton was going to sell us Americans out even more. She was going to probably pass the TPP or TTIP or both of them, and she was taking money. We know this from Julian Assange, who he said this was the biggest revelation from the WikiLeaks Podesta emails, that she knowingly took money from Saudi Arabia and Qatar, and that they were funding ISIS and also Al Qaeda and ISIL. So, and she didn't care. So,
it's even more ugly than that, because those are just donations and payola, pay-to-play kind of relationships under the umbrella of the Clinton Foundation. But roll back the pages of history to 2011, around that time frame, when she's Secretary of State putting forward the policy of what will happen with Libya, and her planning essentially was what was behind the whole destruction of Libya. And Muammar Gaddafi actually came over to the west side, if memory serves, 2004, 2005, I forget exactly when, but he made nice with the West and even fessed up to the Lockerbie bombing, and that actually was false flag pegged on Libya, but he paid reparations for that event, and basically even offered to step down as president when Libya was being targeted by neocons within the Obama administration. And ultimately, Hillary, as Secretary of State, championed the policy of imploding Libya, and Libya was ripped to shreds, and the weapons that ended up in Syria, or in part the result of what happened in Libya. And then we have General Michael T. Flynn, four-star general, former head of the Defense Intelligence Agency, who leaked that State Department memo that made the rounds in 2012, indicating that the assessment of the United States intelligence community was that an Islamic caliphate would be formed within western Iraq and in Syria, and that all of the various allies that were supporting segments of so-called moderate terrorists, as our media kept telling us. It's surrealistic. Hillary was, more so than probably anyone else in the entire Obama administration, responsible for the policies that led to the ultimate destruction of Libya and then ultimately the war in Syria. And we're talking about some 500,000 people that have died as a result of those policies. And not one in 1,000 Americans know what I just said is, in fact, fully documented by government documents. I'm not making any of this stuff up. And we live in that kind of an Orwellian fog, and we dodged a bullet because the neocon faction and the Atlanticist uber liberals that are always telling us that we have to go and fight the next dictator who's going to be the next Hitler and there's killing his people and whatnot. The whole liberal notion of America as the exceptional nation having to go around and be the world's policeman is a complete fantasy. It's all propaganda woven to try to manipulate the American mind to justify wars. And Hillary would have taken us to far more war. People don't even recognize that our President Obama, our wonderful president who was bestowed a Nobel Peace Prize for a silly speech of empty words that he delivered in Cairo at the beginning of his administration, has in fact launched more wars than any other president in recent decades.
And drone strikes. He's killed lots of women and children and innocent people as collateral damage with drone strikes. Yeah.
In the two terms that Obama has been president, we may have seen 700,000 people die in wars that the United States has been involved with. This stuff is not, the Republican Party has a whole mantra about a strong national defense, and more often than not, most Americans are just completely oblivious to how, in fact, what we do abroad, in fact, weakens our defense, and even our armaments and military capabilities and whatnot are diminished from the graft and corruption and just the scope of our system. I mean, it's like the Roman Empire in its declining ages.
Yeah, it's offense what the U.S.'s foreign policy does in many countries. But, we learned a lot of this stuff thanks to the bravery of Julian Assange and the people at WikiLeaks who are willing to publish this. We don't know all of their exact sources, but I totally doubt that it came from Russia like Hillary Clinton and the propaganda mainstream media was claiming. I think it came from probably within the U.S. government, from patriots who didn't want to see Hillary Clinton become president. But I hopefully think that Donald Trump will pardon Julian Assange.
He won't.
You don't think he will?
Oh, no. There's no political reward for Trump that would be sufficient for him to push that hard on that issue. From a political calculus point of view, and I have seen the speculation about that kind of stuff, and I just kind of smirked when I saw it. It's not going to happen. Unfortunately, there's very little incentive for Trump to do something like that. He has to preserve his political capital for other fights.
That's pretty sad, because I think Julian Assange, as we know from exit polls, the information he gave out with the Podesta emails played a big part in helping Trump win the election. So, yeah. I hope at some point, though, that Edward Snowden, Chelsea Manning, Julian Assange all get pardons.
Yeah.
Well, now...
Or in the least, just proven that they're innocent. Or proven that that a decision can be made. In the case of Assange, for example, I mean, part of what is his background is the claims by the Swedish government that he raped someone, and the Swedish government has basically backed off on that claim. So who knows? I mean, maybe he might find freedom in various other developments as opposed to just an outright pardon. But I don't think Trump is going to be making any pardons along those lines, because And frankly, it would cost him a lot of political capital.
Well, in the last part of the show, before we get to the scumbag nominees, let's talk about if you think about Donald Trump's economic policy going forward. He's talked about tax cuts on the private sector. He's released some of his tax cut proposals. He's talking about massive spending, government spending on military and defense, ramping that up on infrastructure. And there was one more spending increase that I'm totally forgetting. Nope. Oh, on the wall. That's the third one, the wall. So those are the three main ones. And you were talking about earlier in the show the bond market's reaction to this. What do you think will be the Federal Reserve's reaction to supply-side economics and Reaganomics? And do you think then that they would be brave enough to actually raise interest rates once this year in December?
Well, I know that the Federal Reserve would like to raise interest rates in part because they're trying to make the credit markets in Europe, for example, more lubricated, and if they raise rates, it puts a little bit less pressure on the European shadow banking system and all of the various things that go on there, and the mechanics. It's kind of complicated. I don't think we necessarily want to dive into that too deeply, but that was part of the reason why the Fed was forced to raise back in December of last year. And I think we're kind of sitting in the same scenario to some extent, combined with the very noticeable and appreciated increase in inflation expectations that have been percolating in the last couple of months, combined with the last 4 days, putting kind of an exclamation point on all of that, with our today going over 3% on the 30-year, et cetera, et cetera. So the Fed will probably just kind of go through the motions. I do believe they're going to raise interest rates in December. And I think that we're going to see a rather weak holiday selling season, and the economy is still in the process of rolling over. And by the time January comes around, there's going to be a lot of enthusiasm when it comes to expectations of what will happen with infrastructure plans and all of this. But simultaneous to that, we still have this worldwide economic downturn dynamic that's still going on. So we have that. We have the rot in the shadow banking system in Europe continuing, and that therefore the very significant fears of a deflationary flywheel still remain. And all of these things are just kind of convalescing, or it's like one giant mosh pit when it comes to how the sentiment and expectations will take form in the coming months, when people just wrap their brains around all of these various contradictory dynamics. So I think the Fed will raise. I think that as the long-term end of credit markets also rise, completely separate of whatever central bankers want to do, because they've already lost control of the longer end of the global bond market, that we will begin to see outcomes in the financial markets that surprise people, starting as early as in the first quarter of next year. And we also have the dynamic of the fact that we've had this super long duration of artificial liquidity and low interest rates, combined with multiple supports that are artificial that have kept equity prices up. From 2014, corporate profits have been sucking eggs. We've been in a corporate profit recession, and yet the stock market still elevates. And now we've got interest rates going up. So we're in a world of hurt. 2017 is going to be ugly.
Yeah, I think worse stagflation is coming, at least for the real economy on Main Street. And, if this infrastructure spending, if it starts driving up consumer goods, consumer prices, look out.
And for the longest time, since 2008 onward, the monetary efforts to reflate the system helped push asset prices up. We saw a percentage of that liquidity get dumped into balance sheets that banks would store at the Fed, and the banks, the Fed's balance sheet as well being over $4 trillion. Those are like sponges that sucked up all of this liquidity, kept asset prices high, but did not 100% pour into the real economy. When you start talking infrastructure plans of trillion-plus dollar magnitude, that though highly efficient the government process of allocating contracts is, granted, it still nonetheless is far more closer to putting real money into people's hands and into the real economy. And we'll see the velocity of money begin to pick up a little bit. We'll see inflation expectations continue to ratchet upward. And these are the kind of things that will end up being a lot more visible to people a couple months further on down the line, even though we're even seeing it now as well, too. And for our listeners, I recommend as well that the article you wrote about the election with the 13 points about Hillary up on the News Doctors is pretty easy to find. We'll put a link on that. And I wrote an article on November 3rd talking about Larry Summers' worst nightmare and how this whole black swan thesis that I think is going to unfold is in fact beginning to be understood by some people. I mean, I think that is part of what is behind the really fast move that we've seen in interest rates in the 4 days since Trump was elected. So I recommend people check out that article too, because I fleshed it out. And Jason and I have been talking about how infrastructure plans are going to shape things on a going forward basis.
Even the Democrats had that plan. A lot of it's based off Larry Summers' plan for the infrastructure. Hillary Clinton was going to do that too. Did you see, though, in the last couple weeks, Larry Summers also said that the Federal Reserve should be nationalized. They should have any hint of independence totally removed from them and be totally nationalized by the government. I guess basically because the inflation that he wants is not occurring fast enough.
Well, yeah, maybe he even thinks of that in the context of his ultimate dream of having a digital currency and, people basically being cattle and having complete control of the monetary system and money supply. Well, who knows?
I don't want to live on the animal farm. I read that book over the summer for the first time, and it was an interesting book by George Orwell, but, they were the animals on. It's a very interesting book. It's only 3 hours long on audio, about 3 hours long on audiobook.
Yeah, it's a great book.
Yeah,
that's kind of what the policy toolkit that Summers is thinking about as a possible way of dealing with the next financial crash. I mean, if people are running on banks, if you don't have cash and you can shut everything down, that is the ultimate Leviathan system where they can stop financial panics. And the Indian government did away with a high denomination note in rupee. The Australian government in the last 2 days has been talking about getting rid of their $100 note. I mean, it's just these policymakers are trying to solve problems by creating new problems.
I feel like we're getting sucker punched.
Yeah.
I feel like every time, maybe so the private sector is improving something that, the government hijacked that technology, just grows over even more. Okay, well, we were going to talk about maybe the stock market betting Trump will fix the real economy, but that could just be also one of our listeners brought up flight capital coming into the U.S. from other countries, as we've seen, currencies in other countries fall rapidly, whether it's Mexico or China. So there's flight capital coming into the U.S. now from other countries and other economies that are not doing as well compared to the U.S. It's going to be an interesting 2017. 2016 is just about wrapped up. We get to our scumbag section now. Okay, so these are all related to the election. It's just, the real deplorable behavior, Eric, that I have to say is not the 50% of Americans that Hillary called deplorables. The real deplorable behavior that I think a lot of our listeners will agree with is how Hillary Clinton acted, how the mainstream media acted, how scumbags, potential 2016 Scumbag of the Year award winner George Soros has acted funding these violent protests now after the election, and how, people like Hillary Clinton were demanding that Donald Trump, behave according to the laws and peacefully allow the election transition process. But yet, now the normal hypocrisy and double standards of what has become the progressive movement, now the people that were preaching, peace, are doing the exact opposite.
Yeah.
It's kind of hilarious. I mean, you can't make this stuff up, Eric. It's the total 180s that are happening. The total So we have, the mainstream media basically saying that, oh, none of our polls are rigged. None of these, all of our coverage is honest and balanced. I've had to block people who were telling me on Twitter, who were, people with 3 degrees, PhD degrees, who were telling me Donald Trump was a Russian agent. It's just unbelievable. I can't believe people with that many degrees they're not dumb people, but they're book smart and have no freaking common sense. It's just really unbelievable. And yet, they want more and more power. They would take away probably so much of our rights because we think so much differently than them. And, they call us names and insult us. And I think, Hillary Clinton, she thought the election was in the bag. When she said the deplorables comment, she thought the fix was in, it was rigged so much by the mainstream media, and she was so ahead in the mainstream polls. She thought when she said that comment, she was like, fuck it. There's no way I can lose. I've already won, so I may as well just give the people who aren't going to vote for me the middle finger. And, it backfired. So I'm really glad it backfired.
Yeah. We, throughout American history, have seen shifts frequently, 40, 50-year cycle kind of things where huge changes and even entire segments of political parties shift around. And we saw that in the 1960s with the Civil Rights Movement and the changes in the South when it came to how Democrats versus Republicans tended to vote, and then on and on. The Barry Goldwater shift in the early 60s and all of that gave rise to the Reagan administration and trends that gave birth to the conservative movement. I mean, these kind of shifts happen, and we're seeing something along those lines right now where there's a certain segment of the Republican Party that's kind of picking up the anti-imperialist, anti-globalist, big trade agreement pacts that do away with jobs and the economic nationalism. All of these things are on the ascendancy within a segment of the Republican Party, as well as the independents, as well as a segment as well, even in the progressive community. I mean, a lot of the Bernie Sanders voters ended up voting for Trump too. So
and union employees who were had felt that they had been betrayed by people like Hillary Clinton.
Exactly. I mean, when a state like Michigan votes for Donald Trump, you're talking about some serious things moving underneath the carpet in the United States body politic. There's been a lot of shifts that are going on, so it's fascinating to watch.
Yeah,
but the thing with progressives, so many progressives have bought into the Kool-Aid and the greenwashing and the spinning about what is in fact object reality, and I'll give a great example. Progressives love Democracy Now! And Amy Goodman's show, and they consider that to be like the penultimate or ultimate in terms of alternative media for the tried and true blue progressives, I'm with her Hillary camp. Well, Amy Goodman's been broadcasting, I guess, 3 or 4 segments over the last 6 months about how the White Helmets guys in Syria are, in fact, this great civil society organization that's going and rescuing people and putting that cute little boy in that picture of the ambulance that made all over the world 2 months ago as a propaganda coup, and all of the things about what was going on with Aleppo and Gary Johnson being a bozo, not knowing what the city is and all of that. The entire narrative on Democracy Now! Served up to progressives who are trying to understand the world and have a predisposition of being against aggressive war, concluded that Assad is gassing his own people and bombing with barrel bombs people in Aleppo and on because of a documented example of this White Helmets group presenting evidence that the Western media would spin. And we have on tape about 3 different instances where these White Helmets guys would commit a terrorist act and then simultaneous or within a single segment of film go on to pick up a stretcher and perform their antics in terms of rescuing people that was thereafter broadcast on Western media. I mean, literally a member of ISIS changing his orientation and then picking up a stretcher to go and save somebody, and that would be the propaganda that would make it onto Western media. And
wow.
It's a perfect example of how Americans are completely brainwashed.
That's like that movie, you remember, from like 20 years ago, Wag the Dog, where they filmed a fake war on a Hollywood green screen?
The level of Orwellian fog is pervasive, and it's just shocking. But enough people are realizing that they're getting screwed by the system, and that was basically what got Trump elected. More so than anything else, it was an economic protest vote against the status quo.
Yeah, and I think the mainstream media, they blew their load. They went all in on this one to try to get Hillary the victory, and any remaining credibility the mainstream media has, they didn't warn us properly about 2008. We know for a fact that they knew what was coming in 2008, and they ignored it. And they let a lot of people on Main Street get really hurt by the collapse 2008. And then, they put any of their remaining credibility behind Hillary Clinton in this election, and now they're trying to backtrack and apologize. But, they were spewing the levels of propaganda, Eric, that were for Hillary Clinton in this election by the mainstream media I had never seen in my lifetime from reading, some of those old newspapers in the past. The other thing I want to talk about before we wrap the show up really quickly was that, I think these WikiLeaks emails, the Podesta emails, the DNC leaks, I think it has created a huge divide now among Democrats after the WikiLeaks. So I think, now there's going to be a lot of Bernie Sanders type of Democrats who aren't going to trust the large corporate types with Wall Street money like Hillary Clinton. So I think the Democrats were counting on more party unity. They had been more unified in the past than Republicans because, libertarians had been starting to split off from Republicans for a while now. I think the Democrats are going to have to deal with this issue as well. So we could be setting up for maybe 3 or 4 parties now going forward in future elections over the next 10, 15, 20 years. Things are going to be split pretty rapidly. And I think that there's the WikiLeaks with the DNC leaks and the Podesta emails has done way more damage to the Democratic Party than the Republican Party. So from hearing people like H.A. Goodman, who does videos on YouTube, he's a Democrat, but he's done good analysis. I watch his videos. He's done good analysis of the WikiLeaks Podesta emails. He goes through them. And, he basically said as a Democrat, he can't trust, a lot of these Wall Street Democrats and the richer Democrats anymore because, they're going to lie to their own Democrat people now to get their vote and screw them over, too.
Yeah. This gets back to, 18 months ago in one of our earlier shows where we were talking about the whole primary contest, and I was under the expectation that the Democratic Party would not be as foolish as they ended up being. And I figured that wiser heads would prevail and that they would ultimately try to position somebody to basically supersede Hillary. And they are now paying the cost of that. I didn't think Hillary was actually going to be able to secure the primary because I figured that the Democratic National Committee would, try to put somebody who would not implode on them. But hubris prevailed, expectations of the power of the ability to spin prevailed, and they went with their girl, and their girl disappointed them. And let's just hope that she fades into history, and maybe, Obama's going to pardon Hillary. That's just a given. But you can't pardon an organization. Presidents can only pardon human beings. The Clinton Foundation is still vulnerable, and this whole story is going to get pretty interesting. The ongoing investigations at the FBI under a Trump presidency are definitely going to be interesting.
Yeah, he needs to get rid of Comey and Loretta Lynch immediately. They're co-conspirators as far as I'm concerned. Ending the email investigations, the second one way too soon. There's no way they could have read through those emails and found any valuable information. There's just no way. There were so many of them. And I hear that they've been blocking a New York Police Department bringing grand jury indictments and grand jury and going to a grand jury. So it's very frustrating. Hopefully Trump will be able to fix this. Rudy Giuliani, who may be the Attorney General, I don't like a lot of his politics, but he has proven to be a pretty competent attorney after going after mobsters and stuff like that.
But he is a hack, and he's a neocon, and he's also part of the cover-up of 9/11, and if you want a perennial scumbag, Giuliani would qualify.
Well,
he's another one of these assholes that we have to be very cognizant of when it comes to whom ultimately is selected by Trump to be his cabinet.
Well, if he's willing to prosecute Hillary Clinton and go after her, then I will at least respect him for that.
Judge Andrew Napolitano, if we had our prayers answered, would be Attorney General. That would be wonderful.
I hear he's on the list, Eric, to be a Supreme Court judge. So that would probably be better. He could make more of an impact on protecting the Constitution as a Supreme Court judge.
Either landing for him would be an amazing landing for the nation, if that were to come to pass.
Yep. And the last scumbag is the Podesta brothers, who, have this revolving door with Saudi Arabia. One of them is directly paid by the government of Saudi Arabia. The other was Hillary Clinton's campaign manager. Also, I think Barack Obama's chief of staff. And, the stuff he was involved in with spirit cooking and all this other stuff is just, I don't know all the details of this. There's internet researchers going after this still. But, if he's doing even 1/10 of the stuff that's being alleged on the internet, he should be in prison the rest of his life. Hopefully someone will have the balls to actually charge him and put him on trial for his child trafficking and pedophilia and all this other garbage that he's potentially involved in. It's just totally disgusting. And really deplorable. The funny thing is, a lot of the time, the way this Orwellian system has worked, Eric, is when the elites, they insult someone like this, when they say, oh, this charge, like Hillary Clinton called Donald Trump a puppet, we all know that Hillary Clinton is the puppet. That was just weird. Yeah.
When the whole scandals that WikiLeaks initiated by the revelations that proved that the Democratic National Committee hosed Sanders in the primary, what was the Hillary camps and the DNC's immediate reaction, and the media as well, parroting the line very dutifully? Well, it was, never mind what was in fact in the emails, never mind denying the content of the emails, which never happened. Well, obviously, it was Putin who delivered all of those leaks.
Yeah,
and the entire narrative shifts to it's just the damn Russians trying to take over our election, and then the FBI a month later is talking to the media about how they're concerned about at a state level, Russians are going to be infiltrating our election, and on and on. It is all propaganda. Changing of the subject, deflection of attention, so as to, save the ire, to move the ire of the American people towards something else. And that's what, in fact, the Democrats did.
Yeah, those emails were stolen by the Russians. It's all the Russians' fault. Let's not talk about the content that's actually in the emails. The content's true, by the way. Look at Donna Brazile resigning and Scott Foval.
Exactly.
Scott Foval.
We know that the content, first of all, the content was never denied, ever. And the reactions prove that, in fact, Donna's resignation is an example.
Yep.
Or all the proof of providing the Hillary's camp with debate questions in advance of debates. I mean, none of that was ever denied.
Yep. Plus, you can find Scott Foval, who was in the videos on Project Veritas, the guy with the glasses in the Project Veritas videos about DNC inciting violence, and also, accepting contributions from a foreign donor. They fired him, and then he went on Twitter rants and started admitting a lot of the stuff was true. So maybe, someone could interview him. I'm not sure. Maybe he has a non-disclosure agreement. But anyways, he was on Twitter, bashing the Democrats because they fired him because he was caught in the videos, saying, a lot of the allegations about Hillary Clinton and the Democrats about their corruption is all true.
Yep.
Oh, you gotta love it. You can't make this stuff up, man. This is like a living drama here.
Who says politics is boring? I mean, come on, this is high drama. Game of Thrones times 20.
Well, it had been boring prior to this. I mean, Mittens Romney was such a horrible candidate. He was like so droopy and boring. So, but maybe future Republicans or people that are libertarian who will run on the Republican ticket will copy the Ronald Reagan, Donald Trump. Maybe not necessarily all those crazy tweets and the crazy stuff that Trump says, but the model for winning through the Republican, the Republican, party, and flip those swing states there. that Trump and Ronald Reagan were able to. But yeah, we definitely live in interesting times. This has been it for the show. We ran a little bit longer, but we had all this fun election drama to discuss. I'm actually glad that the election is over. I'm even more glad that Hillary Clinton didn't win because, I'd be worried about her silencing us here in the independent media. So thank you, Donald Trump, for beating Hillary Clinton. I didn't vote for you, Donald Trump, but I'm glad you won.
You're not going to Panama, Jason.
Well, maybe on vacation.
Not yet, at least.
On vacation, not moving there.
Yeah.
Not moving there. Okay, well, that's it for episode number 29, and welcome to Dystopia. And we'll try to be back on with another show, hopefully before Janet Yellen decides to either increase interest rates or stand still and not do anything.